Well, good evening. Welcome to the first of our calling our author events. Two of these, where we get two authors of our books that have similar themes or ideas, and they get them to have a really conversation. Really, I'm the associate publisher at SEM Press, and today we're delighted to have two of our North America-based authors, Thia Cooper, who is at Gustavus Adolphus College and completed her PhD under Marcella Althaus-Reid. She's written recently this book, Queer and Indecent, an introduction to Marcella's work, which really just tries to tease apart some of the sort of themes, some of the ideas, some of the strands in Marcella's thought, which is, if you've read any Marcella Althaus-Reid, you'll know that she's extraordinary, but quite difficult and quite a tough task to work through. So this book is a bit of a gift in terms of making sense of her work, and so we look forward to hearing a little bit more later. We've also got Natalie Wigg-Stevenson with us. She's in Toronto, and she's the author of this book, Transgressive Devotion. I'll just get my finger out of the way. There we go. Transgressive Devotion, Theology as Performance Art. And this is a really extraordinary book. Pete Ward describes it as mesmerizing, which I think is a very apt description. And actually Emily Scott as well, just to quote one of the other endorsers, had a wonderful phrase to describe it. She said, like falling through a series of trapdoors located at the foundation. So both of these books, I should say, that's what we do, is both of them are available at a discount price at the moment if you go to sempress.co.uk, a fact of which I will no doubt remind you later. So what we're going to do this evening is give both Natalie and Thia a chance to introduce their books, introduce a few of their ideas to us. They will then have a conversation between themselves, and later those of us watching live, you can send in your questions, and the way to do that is going to be to use the comments feature in YouTube. Do also use the comments feature in YouTube to get a sort of picture. It would be great to hear where you are tuning in from, and so do say hello. If my reception is really bad, I don't know if you told the reception is very bad, I'm very sorry about that. The Wi-Fi is normally spectacular, but apparently not today. So anyway, to Thia, who does have a fabulous wife, all fine, and we'll take it from now. I pass over.
Thank you. I hope I have fabulous Wi-Fi. I guess we'll find out. So I was going to start by talking a little bit about how I came to write the book, and then try to summarize a few of the key themes of Marcella, which only a couple, because we only have an hour, so it's all good. So Marcella, yes, was my PhD supervisor at the University of Edinburgh. She really helped me develop as a liberation theologian. I think I kind of came in to the PhD understanding liberation was needed from economic poverty, and had very little understanding of other forms of poverty, right? Political, sexual, gender, race, all of that. And she really opened my eyes to a lot of this. It was in conversations mainly with her that I developed this. I didn't come to understand her books until much later. I quite honestly was intimidated by them a little bit at first. I did over the years understand her better in conversation and her books. And then I've recommended her to several people. And I was having a coffee with one of my pastor friends and recommended her book. And he said, he tried to read it, but had a hard time, past the introduction. And so I thought, oh, I should really write an article about that and, kind of introducing her work. And he suggested it might be a book. And it turned out that he was right. It was a book. So that is where the book came from. Let me just summarize a couple of the themes that I covered in the book, which of course are not all. Also, Marcella would have been appalled to be systematized. So please do not take this as, this is Marcella's corpus and what it means. What she kind of thought was that any theology should always be critiqued or thought about in terms of what was going on in the real lives of real people. So if someone comes to Marcella's work and finds their own experience is different, absolutely fine. Their experience is valid. For Marcella, she was a feminist and liberationist, but also very critical of much of liberation theology and feminist theology. Sometimes she called it vanilla in some ways. The fact that it really did tend to avoid, in many cases, the real lives of people. So, for example, liberation theology in its early years was very homophobic in many cases. One of the things that she argued was that sex and sexuality are a way to know God, right? We know God from our own experiences and from the experiences we have with other people. And so what's important is that in our actions in our daily lives, we're doing theology. We're not thinking about theology. I mean, maybe you are thinking about theology, but that's not what's important. It's what we do that actually shows our theology. And she kind of contrasted this to what she called T-theology or totalitarian theology. She used a lot of different academic analyses in her work, from post-colonialism to queer studies to feminist studies, critiques of capitalism. Fortunately, you don't need to know about all of those things to read her work, but if you happen to be an expert in one of those areas, it is an easy way to dive in. If you know something about post-colonialism, kind of starting with her post-colonial analysis will kind of guide you in a little bit more easily. One of the keys for her as well was that there should be a diversity of theology. So there should be many theologies rather than one set theology. And one of the things that she did with indecent theology or queer theology was to oppose it to what she considered decent, trying to make people decent. And then queering as well, kind of undoing some of those hidden norms, sometimes not so hidden, but a lot of the hidden heterosexual norms that are in theology. So that is my very brief introduction to Marcella, and I hope she's not rolling over wherever she is at the moment. Natalie.
Thank you, Thia, and thanks to SCM and to David and Nicola for pulling this event together. I mean, really special thanks to Thia. When I read her book, I've been reading Marcella Althaus-Reid for years, and I was so awestruck at her capacity to make something that feels so inaccessible feel so accessible. So I really recommend this book as an intro to Marcella Althaus-Reid's work. I came to Althaus-Reid towards the end of my MDiv, so that was about 15 years ago, and I read sections of her Indecent Theology in my queer liturgy class. So this was at Yale Divinity School, which is a school that is so steeped in the traditions of narrative theology. But Althaus-Reid's narratives weren't the ones that I had been studying up until then. And so in this moment of it being studied, her work being studied in the context of liturgy and narrative, it kind of opened up my imagination for a new encounter with the divine. It kind of grounded her work with the status of the revelatory for me. And so she's been a constant companion to me over the years as I've tried to figure out what it is I'm trying to do with theology. My own work incorporates ethnographic research methods into theological constructions, and in this book, theological performances. And Marcella Althaus-Reid wasn't an ethnographer. She was particularly interested in indecency, as Thia pointed out, And in that, she wanted to get at sort of not just the implicit economic, heteronormative, gendered, and so on dynamics of dominant Christian metaphors or stories or doctrines. She wanted to get at how indecency can reveal the mechanisms of how we do theology to reproduce those norms. And even though I wasn't working explicitly on sexual narratives at the time, it was the way in which her work wasn't just focused on content, but on method that was really intriguing and inspiring to me. So for her, she's known really well for telling these indecent narratives, and I should put that in quotes because that's the language that she chooses to use for them, these so-called indecent narratives outside of mainstream decency of Christian practice. Foot fetishists, she has an incredible theology of a voyeur God, really sort of stretching the envelope of what's acceptable, just ripping the envelope up and throwing it out of the window of what's acceptable. But it's not just about telling those different theological stories. For her, it really is about doing theology differently. And so it was those mechanisms of theological construction that I got really interested in reading her. So in this most recent project that David showed you earlier, the book Transgressive Devotion, I wanted to return to the erotic dimensions of Althaus-Reid's project. There are ways that I've tried to depart from what she's doing, and sort of like Thia, I think it's those of us who've been inspired by her work are taking it in different directions that I wish we could know what she thought of them. She wouldn't have wanted to be systematized, and yet I think the accessibility that systematizing makes possible is something she probably would have loved. She had this goal to destroy the big T theology, and I am really drawn to big T theology, not to preserve it, but to rupture and rearrange it and redeploy it in different kinds of ways. And so there's ways we've taken up her project, I think, that are not necessarily sanctioned by it and yet are in its lineage. So what I wanted to do was, again, take the erotic as method rather than just content, although in this work it is content as well, by taking these traditional theological systems, which again, I think Althaus-Reid resisted, and pushing them up against their limits to try to break them and then intensify them into something new. And so if you know queer theory, you might recognize that language from Carmen McKendrick's work about counter pleasures, or Anna Mercedes' work on kenosis and sexuality. But this idea that you can do a limit play with a theological system to actually create a space of fantasy in which truths can be revealed in ways that descriptions of reality might not make possible. So theological fantasy over theological reality done through this kind of, again, erotic as method, as a type of limit play to theological systems. I also wanted to explore concepts of time in her work and expand those through work in queer theory that had happened after her extremely untimely death, particularly in queer temporality. And I wanted to work with a queer historiographical reading of the Christian traditions. And so time in queer temporality is not understood as linear and progressive, but there are attempts to think about chrononormativity and heteronormativity in relationship to time as generationally progressive. And the idea of relating to time for queer temporal theorists being more about sort of lagging, moving backwards, moving forwards, performing multiple tropes of temporality at the same time. And so I wanted to bring that idea again, sort of extending from this queer trajectory in Marcella Althaus-Reid's work in relation to the Christian traditions. So really kind of take those traditions and perform them in their modes of disruption, consolidation, erasure, subversion, submission, all sort of trying to create or clear space for God to appear. Now, when I try to describe this project, which I had my 10 minutes to do here, I often find it a little tricky to explain all the parts. So I thought it might be, it might make a bit more sense just to read you a short reading from it, and one that's very much in the lineage of Marcella's work. So in this section, I'm going to read to you, I was very inspired by the way she really took on liberation theology. So not just sort of classic theology, but sort of the avant-garde of the world she was working in. And so part of what I was trying to do in this book was take on classic feminist theologies to try to sort of break them open again and put them into more radical configurations. And so earlier classic feminist theory and theology was very anti-BDSM. Viewed it as misogynist violence, really wanted to frame God as a sadomasochist, particularly as a sadist, and really dismantle that idea of God into something that is just very mutually loving. And all of this is, I believe, true of God. But there's something that got lost in that early feminist critique, I think, that made God less terrifying than the God of the universe actually is. And so part of what I wanted to do with the classical tradition and feminism was play with that. And alongside Marcella's attempts to do the offensive, to try to open up some new insight into what it means to relate to God, I wanted to bring that edge play again of thinking about what does it mean to actually be in relationship with the creator of the universe, who also has the power to destroy the universe. So in that, I wanted to take that classic feminist view of God as a sadist and recast the divine as the masochist. So this is a reading from the book on God as the bottom. God's desire is always prior to human desire. The ascetic's desire is therefore a replication, consolidating, and continuing divine desire as it returns to its source. The ascetic mirrors the Son as he mirrors the Father, each one translucent to the other in the kenotic overflow of power. To have the mind of Christ means participating in God's own kenotic fantasy, as it is performed on, with, and through our bodies. God is not a sadist in this scene. He's the primary masochist, teaching all of us what power and vulnerability can be. God's fantasy is the fantasy of erotic ruination. So God was so lonely in the self-sufficiency of his own autonomy that his desire created limits against which he could push. And push he did, building and intensifying his desire until it became insatiable. And recognizing the explosive value of unreleased desire, God got quite literally creative. Trading self-sufficiency for self-transcendence, God made himself the object of his own desire. He made himself a man. Self-projections are not always a bad thing. In fact, God called the Adam of his image good. And when this particular fantasy of self-emptying failed to come to good fruition, God's desire wasn't dampened. It was rather only intensified, reignited by the chase to find another way. Because as we all know, that first Adam didn't quite work out. First loves rarely do. So God made himself man after man after man, each one a different projection of his fantasy, each one performing a repetition that could consolidate or displace God's desire anew. Each man's ruin taught God a little bit more about what he actually wanted, until he became able to make himself a man once more. But this time, really make himself a man. In the second Adam, God's desire for erotic ruination passed from fantasy to reality, took on flesh, and was undone. Here God got what he wanted all along, autonomy not as self-sufficiency, not even really or at least primarily as self-transcendence, but rather fundamentally as self-negation, poured out into a completely unexpected yet terrifyingly intensified revelation of God in flesh. Pressing up against the limits of skin, sweat, and hair, the borders between creator and created were shattered in the masochistic fantasy of incarnation. Life, and then death, and as the story goes, then life once more, but not quite yet. God's broken body, both in the flesh and in the church, and in their brokenness and ours, the story of God's ruin keeps on being told, the eternal caught up in faulty fantasies of redemption. So what I really wanted to do is take these wild images that Marcella uses and but here reanimate them with a surprisingly orthodox and biblical vision, which again is sort of outside of what she tried to do with them. But again, I hope in a lineage that she would perhaps have appreciated. So Thia, you're going to start us off in our conversation.
I just wrote down like 12 things I want to ask you. But let's try not to be totally like, oh my gosh, overwhelming right at the beginning.
We're going to save the overwhelming for the end.
We're we're gonna throw the overwhelming in a few minutes once we just
Get ready,
get our
everyone.
bearings.
Yep.
So it's all just prep. One of the pieces I really, really liked is this concept of theological fantasy. Because for me, I think even, living our own lives, we talk about this aspect of performance. Doing theology in any way is fantasy, right? Because we don't know the actual theological reality, right? We aren't God. And one of the particular pieces that I want to pick up on that really struck me in your book was when you mentioned that out of everything that you wrote, one of the things that someone had a problem with was Mary potentially having an orgasm. And that just cracked me up. This sense in which, we can fantasize in all these different ways about the divine, but then we come up against certain limits, right? And one of those being, oh my gosh, Mary could not have had an orgasm. Or, and you point this out in various other places in your book, right? This sense of, do we really want to think about God suffering? Or as you just noted, right, do we really want to think about God being lonely? Right? There are ways in which we want to fantasize and then we suddenly are like, oh, yep, reach the limit. Nope, that's not appropriate.
Yeah, thanks. I came to the language of fantasy by going through some queer theory and recognizing how much the way it was used there, and some queer psychotherapy, realizing the way that it was used there was so resonant with how I understand the kingdom of God. It's always going to come back to really orthodox, even patriarchal theology for me. But bringing back to the only way we inhabit God's imagination for what we should be are these imaginative acts, and not imagination as the sort of reduction to what's not real, but imagination is that space for creativity with this God who is creative. And so part of what I wanted to do was, like you say, come up against these limits where we often stop, and then just go a couple steps past them, which is why something like Mary's orgasm appears. I went so back and forth on whether that should stay in or come out of the book. And some people were like, you should take that out. And others were like, why would you take that? Whatever it was around Mary's orgasm, everyone's response was strong. And that was intriguing to me, that it was like, it couldn't just be neutral. So even for those who are like,
Right.
why can't you talk about Mary's orgasm? It's still really meaningful and important. Yet it's the provocation of it is, it really does make God very human in the act of incarnation, and God, like the external God, not the external God, being what we call the transcendent God. It really makes that an act, an evening time act, rather than the humanity being all held in Jesus. And so I want to extend it to there.
Yeah,
if that makes sense.
I mean, it makes me think about, that we really do want to put limits on God. And I think, one of the things that really resonates for me within Marcella's work is this concept of the marginal God. So not just a God who lives at the margins, but the God who emerges at the margins. One of the things when I first encountered Minjung theology that I really appreciated about it was this sense that, we've imprisoned God, right? We've created this box for God, and God has to be in this box, and anything outside this box is not possible. And so, maybe God is now in exile, right? However we conceive of that. But there's a sense in which God is so expansive, and also with your comment about time, right? God is not static, I don't think. God is becoming, right? I mean, why do we have this sense that God just is what God is and that's it, right? There's nothing else. So again, pushing up against these notions of God as having to be within this particular box, or God as not being able to suffer, or even the notion of God's power, which maybe we could unpack a little bit. It's strange to me where we set those limits sometimes. Like, like Mary couldn't have had an orgasm. God couldn't have caused Mary to have an orgasm. Like, why is that the thing? Out of all the the weird things that we might have God do. Like, why is that the one that causes the problem? So yeah, I mean, so this whole, the way that we think about God and the way that we put limits on how we think about God, I find really fascinating. One of the pieces I was also going to pick up on is when in the book, when someone from the study group talks about the possibility of God having dementia, or what would that be like, right? God with aspects of dementia, which I just found fascinating, and quite frankly have not stopped thinking about. But maybe would you talk a little bit about that concept and how it, because you had quite a reaction to it too, it sounded like, when she was talking about that in the study group.
Yeah, sorry, my Microsoft Teams was exploding there for a second, so I was trying to get rid of it. Yeah, so first I just want to go back to what you were saying, and maybe we can pick this up in a minute in your own work about this limit setting. Because I think I would be curious to hear more from you about that marginal idea of, I think for me, it would be more, okay, but the box is necessary in a sense for the language that we would use to access the divine. And Marcella Althaus-Reid really blows that up more, I think, than I want to do. But then at the same time, she's sort of drawing on the ways we embody that language. And that's something I've had a hard time tracking in her work, that the ethnographic impulse of a lot of my colleagues, and you do ethnographic work too, of getting at how that traditional theological language gets into people's embodied ways of being. And that's why the imagery that she works with is so potent, because it's still connected to that traditional language in a way. And so that box matters again for the limit play. Without the box, if we just expanded everything, we wouldn't have the play there that I think matters in her work and we're striving for. So that's, I would like you to address that as well. And I know that our lists are going to get really long here. But the work around dementia was, so the ethnographic piece, for those who don't know in this project, was that during my doctoral fieldwork, I taught historical theology based on my doctoral exams in the Baptist congregation of which I was a member and where I had been ordained. And so I was taking a historical approach to various doctrines in a church basement with a group of about 20 members of the congregation, trying to look at what, if we brought academic and everyday theologies together, became possible in their interactions for thinking about theology in new ways. And so one night we were grappling with this understanding of God's eternity and our incapacity to really wrap our minds around that. And a woman in the group told a story about how she had been away at a cabin with some friends, and one of those friends brought another friend who was living with dementia. And she said that her encounter with that woman was a kind of timelessness. The woman could remember far in the past, but couldn't remember what had just happened. And that in a sense, this was helping her understand God's eternal nature, because God is always sort of present in the now, the vastness of God's memory. And so at the time, I felt like I couldn't quite figure out how to engage this story. But then later I had a faith crisis myself. And the story all of a sudden started making sense to me in terms of when we experience God's absence. And the dementia metaphor, which, just to put a little bit of hedging around it, of the danger of working with a dementia metaphor as well. And so I spent a decade trying to write that chapter, to do my very, very best to guard against romanticizing or play with the metaphor. And it was really trying to work with this understanding of what it would mean to be forgotten by God, and then how we would relate to God in that space of forgetting. How would we draw God's relationship back to us if we were living with a God who had forgotten us? So the dementia part of the book, I was trying to grapple with God's suffering, but also our own suffering in relation to God, and feeling lost at times in the life of faith. And then taking this trajectory through the Christian traditions that goes through Luther, and in our time through Moltmann, and I think in disability theology, that wants to really push the edges, but then not push them again to that point of breaking, and not pushing them to the point of fantasy, really still wanting to keep it within the realm of reality in a way that cuts short the imaginative possibilities of God. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm thinking, one of the things that sticks in my mind is this idea that if we are all created in the image of God, right? All of us in all of our messiness in some way, right, show us pieces of God. So a woman with dementia, right, shows us one aspect of God. This is one, like, mental health, physical health, anything that we see as normal is only one particular image of God, right? All of these other pieces that so often in society we deem as somehow abnormal, those are all also in God's image, right?
Mm-hmm.
God's image is just much larger than what we can really conceive of. And I think part of this, Natalie, might go back to what you were saying, if I could talk a little bit about God at the margins. Kind of the way I think about it is, so let me back up one step. Okay, so I am not at the margins. Let me just be clear. Like, I am quite firmly, now. I may have been at the margins when I was a kid, growing up poor, and even then, not really. But okay, I come to know God through my relationships with other people, right? I am in relation with a ton of people, quite possibly the entire globe. Not consciously, but I'll give like one example. Let's say I was wanting to buy a pickup truck. Okay. That decision is incredibly complicated if you think about the lives of the people it affects around the world, right? From everybody involved in making the various component parts and how they are treated, right? Not just by their companies, but by the country they live in, right? By the other people they're working with, et cetera, right? So all of this, even in a decision like, should I buy a pickup truck? And let's not forget the environmental factors as well, right? All of this is either kind of building my relationship with God, or is kind of, let's say, condensing it or moving me further away from God. And as people with privilege, there's a lot between us and God, right? There's just a ton. And it doesn't mean God can't be present, but if you think about the way Marcella wrote a little bit in her work about someone who is completely excluded. So let's say, born in rural, wherever, lives on the streets, never had a birth certificate, right? Doesn't have a formal name, like is not part of society in any way. That person's experience of God is, from this perspective, is very visceral, very real, right? There's so much less baggage, I think, in between. How do I describe this? In between that person and the experience of God. So less of that box language that we were just talking about, right? So there's no frame. There's just the actual experience of God. And I think thinking about God in that context is really helpful for me, because sometimes I think the language moves me further away rather than bringing me closer. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, I think I mean, you're talking in a sense about distance rather than enclosures. And so there's a removing of the border there. While I still really do love the play that happens at the borders. I think with what I was thinking when you were talking is about how, well, first, those of us who come with all that privilege that creates I was picturing it as like muck, just muck separating us from God, and thinking, okay, well, what becomes easy is for someone like me to say, I'm jumping to the margins. That's where God is. And I'm just jumping over the muck without realizing, actually, I need by grace to move through it, which is frankly something I'm basically not willing to do. And I suppose I would hope that changes in my lifetime. But right now, I can't say that I'm willing to really walk through that muck to the kid at the border with no with no birth certificate.
Mm-hmm.
I think when those of us with that kind of privilege do think we can do the jump, though, perhaps that's when that kid at the border gets romanticized as having a more genuine experience of God than we do. And I think the power of Marcella Althaus-Reid's work was that she was there. What we didn't really get to see, again, I mean, I think anyone who was in the community 20 years ago, 15 years ago, maybe, when she passed, it was such a shock to have lost her at the moment where we needed to hear her. The grief, and I'm sure, all the more for you, but we never really got to hear what it's like to move from that distance into the normative. She ended up at Edinburgh. Her portrait is now on the wall there. She really came to the center in a certain way. And so it's about the border, the difference, and the movement. All of those things make up our theological thinking and doing, as you've already pointed out. So I wish we could have known more from her about what it was like to move in that other direction.
Yeah, and I would say from the experience I had with her, she really wrestled with that too, right? What happens when you are in the center and are trying to still do authentic work? To what extent is that possible? I feel that, I feel that too all the time. This sense when I walk into a classroom or when I'm writing a book, is this really moving us toward the kingdom of God? Maybe not the kingdom, the kingdom, like a place where we hang out with God, whatever. Is this really, it's just hard to balance that, right? This sense of you want to survive in the world, right? Getting a paycheck is also occasionally enjoyable, regularly enjoyable. But at the same time, to what extent is that bringing us toward a broader understanding of God, or to what extent is that, hindering us from actually reaching that? So, and then, of course, academic arguments about God. My goodness, there's sometimes no one more certain than a theologian, which is kind of amusing for me, given that the more I just study, the less I feel like I know. But that's okay.
Can you speak, Thea? I realize I don't know. I don't have an answer to this, but can you speak about how she wrote about institutions? I mean, you've got me thinking about, we were talking about how your department chair and I direct one of our programs at my school. And I think those moments in the classroom or in writing where we actually do feel like we're coming close to the divine, the kingdom, the revelation of God, let's say, among us. For me, that's why I'm in this work. And those moments are so few and far between, because we spend so much time tending the institutions that make them possible. We both have these administrative aspects to our lives. We have to spend so much time tending the institution to be able then to have those moments. Did she write about that? I feel like she was writing from outside institutions, and I would love to know what she thought about institutions.
Yeah, early on, she wrote a couple of articles and chapters. She didn't write so much later, but there was certainly a tension between the epic critique of the institutions, right, which do not value liberative work, like real doing of theology, right? It just doesn't count for, tenure or whatever. And on the other hand, being critical of institutions for not being inclusive. So there's kind of this tension there between, okay, so she ends up getting, this first chair and it's all amazing and wonderful. On the other hand, that did not enable her to do any more of the real theology. So she wrote a little bit about it, but it was early on in the 90s, about this sort of tension between, as if she had to leave her conscientizing work and come into the university and teach, like there's this big disconnect where shouldn't that be the same? Like, shouldn't this work that we're doing to liberate be done in the university and on the streets? And then of course this goes back to the liberationist notion of structures of sin, right? I mean, the very way that our structures are set up is not doesn't prioritize that, doesn't privilege that, doesn't give it a space.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah, it got me thinking about something else, but then I was listening so intently to you that I lost the thing that I was thinking about. We can't see the audience, so I'm just falling into having a normal human conversation here and forgetting that people are watching.
I know, right?
I feel like
I was just going to say that, but that is, I mean, that's one of the things that I wrestle with too, just the extent to which it's possible within any institution. I'm thinking about it in terms of, even if you think about Black Lives Matter, if you think about these movements, the Occupy movement, sometimes the more successful a movement becomes, it tends to then become institutionalized, and then it can be more and more difficult to have the concrete activism. And fortunately, that hasn't happened, with Black Lives Matter yet, or with some of these other movements. But there's a sense in which anything that becomes institutionalized, then it has a framework, and maybe you draw up a charter, and suddenly, again, these limits come into play that I think are very difficult.
Well, okay, so that's the thing that I think one of the things that is so powerful about Black Lives Matter not being co-opted, I was going to say yet, but I just hope not being co-opted, is I think the intense deployment of narratives of respectability and the refusal to submit to those, and that in a sense sort of parallels with the way that Althaus-Reid is using these narratives of indecency and decency, and I often find with Black Lives Matter feeling myself pulled up into this very sort of eschatological refusal of settling, and in the same way that I experience with Marcella's work of, actually, no, we're going to maintain the fantasy. Back to that language, we're going to maintain the fantasy instead of settling for reality, and live into
Absolutely.
that in a really profound way. And that's where those fantasies in her writing, like the voyeur God is such a potent one, and it's been deployed and critiqued in such important ways. But the idea that God is watching our sex lives and feeling lured to humanity by it, right? Intensely problematic. Like that word doesn't even begin to cover it. And it's had a really important critical race theory responses and feminist responses. And yet at the same time, what it forces us to actually think through on the secondary level of, but what would it mean for God to have that kind of desire for us, that kind of unacceptable desire for humanity, again, rather than the God loves us, right? Which becomes very quickly a sort of a meaningless statement. God is love. God loves us. We're done.
Right.
Yeah. David's asking if we should move to questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But did you want to say, I don't want to cut you off.
No, oh gosh, I could just talk for hours apparently. So no, we'll go to questions.
Are there questions, David?
I would note, as we're waiting for questions, one of my colleagues, when I was initially writing about, because I also wrote a book on a Christian Guide to Liberating Sex or something like this. One of my colleagues was like, I prefer not to think about God when I'm doing that. And I was like, I mean, God's kind of there. I mean, you can be like, okay, can't see ya, but yeah. So there we go.
So, welcome, David.
Hello.
It was a good moment to pop on in.
It's been a fascinating conversation already, but I do want to invite anybody watching this, if they have any questions, please do put them in the comments and the chat. In the meantime, I'm going to throw a really boring editor question at you, which is just, as you wrote the book, your respective books, do you think anything changed in your thinking? But I'm thinking particularly, I know in both, particularly in your case, Natalie, the writing it's arguable where the writing began, whether it began a long time before we had our first conversation, but particularly in the sort of latter stages as you were sort of putting thing together. Does anything spring to mind that you feel sort of changed in your thinking or your approach, that or that shed new light on what you were writing about?
Yeah, I've said, I think that when you write a book, my PhD students get really stressed when I say this, but when you write a book, you go through 10, 20 drafts, and this one went through 100. So by the time I got to you, David, it had gone through so many drafts, and in part because some of the claims in it are so, they're not actually claims, but some of the fantasies in it are so offensive that I wanted to keep talking to the people who were too upset by Mary's orgasm, for example, or the masochist God, or these pieces, really talk to the people who those are upsetting to think through, why is this upsetting? Can I take this image deeper? Can I grapple with it really from my own faith rather than it just being play, like surface play? And so I think that I experienced writing that book again and again and again as a spiritual journey. I took those fantasies into my prayer life. I tried to actually think about what it felt like to relate to the divine through those fantasies. And so it was, for me personally, a transformative experience as I wrote it. I mean, I'll give you the shout out, David, for any authors in the room, that when after we met and you were interested in the book and I sent it to you and we were all very excited about working together, and then you had this response of sort of, this isn't how you did it, but to me it felt like with your British Reserve, oh, this isn't what I thought it was at all. And it was something like, would you like to try a different introduction? You'd seen me give this presentation. You're like, I really thought that your book was going to be more that and less this. And that was the piece where you said, this book should be more not autobiographical, but more, that's the piece that needs to be there, the reason why behind the book. And so I completely rewrote the opening to the book after that, of realizing, yeah, you're right. There's as with any theological book, even if it's a deep read of Karl Barth on whatever, he's always my punching bag, but no matter what it is, it's always being written for deeply personal faith-based reason in theology that doesn't get articulated. And so that was the final stage of transformation of David being like, no, write this better. Write it with the story.
Because that's the bit that always gets missed out, I think. So much theology misses out the theologian. And Thea, what about you? Is there anything?
One of the things, even just thinking about it now, one of the things that I may have tried to avoid in writing were some of these traditional theological concepts, right, and constructs that you're talking about. So, I didn't have a chapter on sin or salvation. But one of the things that really I'm still pondering ever since, wrestling with this, is this notion of salvation and what the language of being in debt to God really means. What does that mean for our relationship with God? And you can't really be in a mutual relationship when one of you is in debt to the other. And so this sense of trying to remove that hierarchy and think about it. Marcella talks in several places about, alternative forms of economy that aren't based on debt. And so what would it look like to have a model of a relationship with God where it's not, where humans actually did have free will? I mean, in a sense, we have free will, but what, you choose to go to hell? Like, how is that a great choice? Do you know what I mean? So there's a sense in which I think about that has really stuck with me, and I've really been thinking about that. What does it mean that as human beings we have free will if we are supposed to make this particular choice?
So we're still without questions, which means you'll have to bear with my second reserve question. which is I was thinking about the notion of shock in both your both your projects, but also in Marcella's work. How much do you to a layman, a laywoman, it feels as you approach these kinds of theologies with their kind of transgressive approaches, and I've heard this said of this sort of work, that it's just trying to shock. And actually that's quite interesting in light of your performance art that you're talking about, Natalie, where it feels like people's reaction, the reaction of just an ordinary, quote unquote ordinary person just sort of encountering that work, they would be thinking, well, all this is trying to do is shock me. Is there more going on, or is there some truth in that? Is that sort of first step to what's being attempted in these sorts of ways of doing theology, or is that barking up entirely the wrong tree?
I would maybe I'll start. It's kind of odd to me sometimes that we find it shocking. I mean, people masturbate, people have orgasms, like there are all kinds of things that happen every day, but yet somehow when you say them out loud, it's shocking. And so I think I think it's only shocking in the sense of, whoa, you've just named something that apparently we're not supposed to talk about. But again, like I said with the colleague who, would prefer God not to be in the bedroom, I mean, God is there. So if you believe in God and you believe in God's presence, God is there. So it's odd. It's kind of funny, the shocking bit to me, because just because we haven't named God as being in this space doesn't mean, God is not present, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I was trying to think through the shock piece quite a bit, because earlier readers had commented that, well, especially those coming out of the classical feminist tradition, that it was too violent, and we'd work so hard to remove, the book was too violent, we'd work so hard to remove any violence from our understanding of God, that clearly I'm not actually a feminist if I want to bring some version of it back in. And so some of the artworks I'm using are violent, and that the reason I'm bringing them in is because I don't think we can jump over the potential. The cross is a violent tool of torture, and the power. I know, Thea, you were talking a minute ago about the mutual experience with God and trying to find ways to live into that mutuality, and then for my part, it's sort of like I want to live into the non-mutuality. I want to think about that hierarchy and work with it, because I do think that God is, better than us. I don't know what the right way to say that would be. Stronger than me, more powerful than me, just bigger than me in every way. There is a power there. That is a power imbalance that I think mutuality doesn't capture. And so I was trying to lean into those things that are shocking. And that's been the interesting part. Like, people are shocked that I would be using masculine language for God, as much as they're shocked by the masochistic God. There's shock that, one student who gave me feedback on it said, I had no idea you were so orthodox. I'm actually incredibly orthodox. And that was sort of, the people would read it and get to the end and say, this is actually a very orthodox book. And it's very strangely an aesthetic, systematic theology. And so I part of that was really trying to work with this question of shock, and what shocks, and where does it shock, and what's the function of shock. And I found Maggie Nelson's work, The Art of Cruelty, really helpful in this, that it's misleading to think that we want to shock people to sort of shake them up. That's a very hollow, unnecessary, or not unnecessary, but it's a very hollow, limited understanding of what shock's function can be. But shock actually does have the power not to just make us see what wasn't there before, what we couldn't see before, but shock can actually reconstitute us, so that we're moved in new directions, and that the violence in art can do that for us sometimes in a really transformative way. I'm doing her a disservice. You should all just read The Art of Cruelty. It's an incredible book on this concept of violence and shock. So I think shock matters, but not in the way, not in a hollow way, not in the like, oh, now I'm so shocked, I'm going to think differently about the world.
Right. And I think that that violence in art sometimes hits us more than violence in real life, right? We sort of walk past and ignore violence in a lot of spaces, but violence in an art performance somehow like stops and makes us pause, right? In ways that everyday violence, we're just used to it. We see it. We don't notice it, right?
Yeah.
So, in the alarming absence of any other questions, there's one last thing I'd like to just throw your way, which, and I apologise if you have actually covered this. I confess I had to dash out for a second to deal with my daughter, so you may have talked about this. But where do you want to leave us? What's next for us once we've put your books down? What?
Well, I can say I'm working on a project right now that's related to the book called the Transgressive Devotional. And it's a web-based resource for ministers who want to take a devotional journey around the book. So that's in design stages right now. Look for it in the new year. Hopefully SCM will tweet it out for me. But it's just again sort of trying to keep moving in these directions. Part of what I was trying to do here was think about a proliferation of potential genres for theological communication. So this one being literary-based, art-based, and then this next one, again, sort of playing with modes of representation to communicate theologically across the people those of us who want to encounter God. So working on a web-based devotional, transgressive devotional guide out in the new year, I hope.
For me, I think it would be encouraging people to start from right where they are, or the issues they're facing. You know, I mean, the book I wrote on sex previously came out of conversations I was having with my students. My God, if you do not want to talk about sex with your students, do not become a religion professor at a small liberal arts college, because holy buckets. That was a lot. Yes. Okay. That's a conversation for another day. But the other piece that I have been thinking a lot about, apart from sex, which I hope I can set aside for a little bit, is work. You know, so much of our lives are spent in work, and so thinking about what does it mean to do good work? How is work a part of our lives? I guess that's kind of what's on right in front of me at the moment. And I know, COVID has pushed that to the fore for a lot of people, thinking about what does work mean and what is good work. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of thinking to be done around work, at least for me.
Some interesting next directions. Wonderful. Just had a nice comment here from Tony Franklin Ross, who's in Auckland. So all the way from the other side. We thought we were doing long distance across the Atlantic, but this is the other side of the world. Wonderful to have you with us. And he says, thank you for the presentation. Really got my theological juices going again. Pondering a PhD project on queer theology, engaging the ecumenical project. Marcella Transgression might be interesting. So there we are. We've set somebody off on their journey, and I'm sure lots of other folks will watch this as well after the event. This video will still be up for some time. Well, it'll stay up sort of semi-permanently as long as YouTube exists. So millions of years, I'm sure. And you'll be able to tune.
Oh God.
Leave you with that dystopia. Yes, so I'm sure you'll be able to tune in and check out what's and have a listen again if there's bits that you missed or whatever. But it just remains for me to thank Thia and Natalie for engaging us, for getting our theological juices going, as Tony puts it, and it's been a fascinating conversation. Don't forget the books are available, so you can get both books from our website, which is scmpress.co.uk. So do check those out, and they've got little discounts on them at the moment as well, so it's a good time to buy them. We hope to do more of these sorts of things where we get a couple of authors to chat about their work. I think it's quite an interesting way of finding commonalities and getting. I don't think you guys have met before, had you? No. So there we are. That's it. So it's nice to be able to do that. And good. So hope you've had a really good evening with us, and we look forward to seeing you for the next
afternoon.
thing. Or afternoon,
Morning,
or indeed
whenever,
for Tony, 7
whatever.
o'clock in the morning, or whatever it is.
Thank you.
Thanks all. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.